think that's there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking your seats now. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you in this beautiful building. My name is Olivier Boutellis. I'm the Chief Executive of Accountancy Europe. However, today I think I have a kind of identity crisis because I'm not going to be talking to you in this capacity. I will just be the spokesperson of a task force that we have put together and who has been working on this paper that you've seen that we're going to be launching today. And this task force has been working totally independently as part of a series of papers that we call Cogito, I think. You know, Cogito, the man Descartes who actually introduced the idea of professional skepticism in a way, doubt, so something that is very, very close to the heart of auditors. And as I have this identity crisis to manage, and I can't really speak in my capacity today, well, I have asked Jyoti Banerjee to be our host today and to be the moderator. Jyoti, please take over.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this wonderful location. I noticed that there are a number of pianos in the room, so if any of you get bored, you're hearing about Olivier's report and you think, I've had enough, you might be able to go and tinkle on some ivories and hopefully we'll get some better sounds. But Olivier, in the first instance, we're going to give you every chance to share the outcome of the work. I hope it's interesting enough that we stay away from the pianos. But our goal today, really, is to have an open conversation. We want to ask questions about the direction that corporate governance is going in. We want to understand whether the issues that are raised by the task force that Olivier is talking about, whether those issues are something we can agree with. So we've constructed today really as an opportunity for each of us to hear a number of different perspectives. So we will hear what the task force has to say to us about their views. They've been thinking about it, and they're bringing their professional skepticism and so on to the party. We want to hear what their views are. Do they have some good ideas around corporate governance? Perhaps some of you have even had the chance to read the paper that they have created. But we've also invited some other people to come here and share their views. So we're going to hear different perspectives. And at the core of this is going to be an opportunity to have a debate. And we have people who will be representing different sides of the debate. Some may be in favor of the ideas that are being launched in the paper. Some may say, actually, this doesn't make any sense, and this is why. So we'll have the chance to hear that. But this is not just a hearing session. This is also a participative session, and I'm going to encourage you to join in, to take part. And so right through the day, we will be exploring your ideas as well. So I want you to feed them to us, and this is how you can do it. So you can tweet your questions, and there's some kind of machine that's going to receive your tweets and share them with us, and so we'll be able to accept that. So go ahead and tweet, and the addresses are there, Sustainable Corp Gov or Accountancy EU. We have a live stream, so we're not the only people in this debate. There is a World Wide Web out there, and there are participants who are coming in from different parts of the world, I understand, and so we may get some questions from out there. And by the way, we won't give up on the old method, which is raise your hand and say, I've got a question. I really want to ask this question because I don't agree with something I've heard, or I want to reinforce what somebody has said, and I want to add a little more extra vim and vigor to their comments. So we will explore all different opportunities. Just to introduce myself, my name is Jyoti Banerjee, as Olivier said. I'm a partner at Fronesys, which is a UK-based advisory service. And I really come with very little expertise in the matter of corporate governance. So I'm here as an enthusiastic amateur, if you like. It's the same view that I had when I got invited by the gentleman who's sitting here, in fact, in the front, Paul Druckman, who started the movement around integrated reporting, and he said, will you come and help me? So I have been part of the movement around around integrated reporting pretty much from its inception. But I did so as an enthusiastic amateur. I brought very little real knowledge and expertise to the issue. And so I suspect if I have questions to ask of these people, you might think these are really stupid questions. And that's why you need to ask the questions. You know, keep me away from asking the questions. You bring your questions, you bring your comments to this, and let's see what we can do with it. And when we go away from here, my goal is that I want to know what we are each going to do tomorrow when we get back to work. Will there be anything that comes up today that we think, this really makes sense? We need to do something here. Or is there going to be something that you're going to say, we need to stop something that we're doing? I'm going to ask you for those questions. And by the way, to each of the speakers, let me warn you, I'm going to ask you that same question as well. So you better be ready. What is it that you're going to be prepared to announce today that you will be doing tomorrow? And we might have to call you tomorrow or check on the live stream whether you're going to do these things. But let's find out whether there are some real things that we can do, or is this just a cogito debate? I hope it's more than that. So, Olivier, just to get us started, I'd like to invite you to come up and share with us something of this report that you're so excited about.
Thank you, Jyoti. Well, with an enthusiastic amateur and a CEO who's not speaking on behalf of his organization, but on behalf of the task force, I think we're in a good shape today to have this conversation. So let me see if I can pass the slides. Yes, so I'm going to present very quickly some of the main lines of this paper. And one thing that really started us working on that was that, well, we've seen a few people taking the streets. And this is, you will have seen that the level of awareness is just growing. And we've got a few hundreds of thousands of people, young people, less young people, who went and started protesting about the lack of action on what is now affecting the planet. Even in Washington, D.C., actually, we saw 200,000 people. I think the guy who's got the top job in Washington, D.C. was not part of them. But nonetheless, there were a lot of people protesting. And that's not really new. Not really new because fearing something like the end of the world, the last judgment of Bruegel, as you see on the picture, not the think tank, the painter. Bruegel actually, and many others, have warned that the end of the world was coming. And we've got used to that, I think, in the meantime, because we've seen a lot of people, lunatics and priests. I think, well, some of them you know. Here is Hilary de Poitiers, a French bishop. I mean, this guy predicted the end of the world for 365, and he had the bad idea of dying 2 years later. So he knew that his prediction was wrong. But the one I really like is Jane Dixon here, because now with Jane Dixon, you're really talking about serious stuff. She was an American astrologist, and she's been advising President Richard Nixon and First Lady Nancy Reagan. And she got a number of predictions actually quite right. She's reported on the day of her death, actually in 1997, to have said, just before dying, I knew this would happen. And that was a pretty accurate prediction, so I think we can probably trust her to a certain extent. And she predicted the end of the world for 2020. That's pretty soon, right? That's pretty soon. The good news, however, is that this was her second guess. Her first guess was 1962, which I think she kind of got wrong. But the people today who are kind of warning that we may be nearing the end, maybe not of the world, but the world as we know it, the world as we got used to in the past, say, 100 years, more or less. The people who are predicting that today are not lunatics and priests and other gurus, they're scientists. They're people who are doing their homework. They're people who are looking at data. They're looking at, they're studying the story. And you've just a few of them here on the slide. And to start with, we have Dennis Meadow, who was asked by the Club of Rome, not really a group of dangerous activists, right, to do a report that was a really seminal report called The Limits to Growth. And the report was seen as very controversial. However, 30 years later, actually, it did another report, a 30 years update. And in this report, actually, it was shown, and I need to look at the quote I selected for you. It was shown, actually, that most of these predictions were right in the first place. That was also demonstrated by the University of Melbourne. And the conclusion that Meadow was drawing was, now we must tell people how to manage an orderly reduction of their activities back down below the levels of the Earth's resources. So that's the challenge we have to deal with. And you see a number of our people here. Everybody's talking about climate. Very excited, especially in this town, about climate. Now, the reality is that this is not the only thing that matters. You've seen recently the report on the destruction of biodiversity. But if you put yourself in a business perspective, which is our perspective here today, we're looking at business. Well, one of the main problems that business is having and is going to growingly have is access to resources. Therefore, the International Resource Panel here on this slide, and of course, scientists are scientists, so they like to argue, and they're very prudent. But whether you look at iron, lithium, phosphor, a number of resources that are absolutely critical to business. Without these resources, you say goodbye to your telephones, you say goodbye to your cars, you say goodbye to our lifestyle, and you say goodbye to all the businesses that are producing, these tools that we got addicted to. And well, depending on the numbers, you basically see numbers that vary from 10 to 100 years for these resources. Yes, it is a big gap, but from a business perspective, what difference does it make? If I'm running out of resources, a critical resource in 10 years or in 100 years, the impact of that uncertainty is going to significantly impact my business. So that's what we've been looking at. I forgot, actually, the gentleman in the middle here who's particularly serious because he got a Nobel Prize, actually, Mr. Joseph Crutzen. And he's the one who invented the word the Anthropocene. I'm sure you've all heard about this because it's been quite heavily commented last week, a few weeks ago, as now being accepted as a concept of the era in which we live today, which is the era in which we, mankind, are basically destroying the planet, changing the entire ecosystem. And what I find interesting, there are many such graphs that are used to qualify, to characterize the Anthropocene. What I find really interesting is that all these curves are more or less all going in the same direction, and this direction is upward, and they don't change. And it's been like that for a number of years now. And we had treaties. We had the Paris Agreement in 2015. We had the Rio Agreement in 1992. And does that, all these series of agreements, have they changed anything? No. And the other curve that goes in the same direction is actually growth, GDP growth, that has been raising and raising. And it's interesting to see that these two curves have exactly the same shape and go more or less in the same direction, with one dip here that is not explained by one of these fantastic international grand messes. It's unfortunately explained by the financial crisis. So this is a business issue that we're talking about today. And there are plenty of people who are looking at what it is that we can do. And the United Nations came up with the infamous SDGs, which we believe, that's one of the ideas in the paper, is something that should really serve as a benchmark of responsible corporate governance. However, there is a debate now with the SDGs, which is that a number of scientists think that the SDGs cannot be achieved within the planetary boundaries. If we would be to achieve the 17 SDGs, we would just explode our resources on a planet that holds these resources for us. So this is only a half solution, I believe. We need to look beyond that. And the point we're making in the paper is that the only thing today that seems to be our chance of staying in business and preserving elements of the world as we know it. Again, I'm not telling you that, unless there is a story between the US and Iran, but I'm not telling you this is the end of the world, but the world as we know it. So, one thing that seems to be quite a source of hope, and the European Commission is very right, I think, to work on that, is moving to a truly circular economy. Great word, fantastic concept. At macro level, you can see what a circular economy is. But what does it mean for me? What does it mean for me as a manager? That's the question we ask ourselves. And we think it means that companies have to transform their business model. I mean, change is not an abstract concept that is out there and that someone will say we have to move to a circular economy and things will happen. I mean, it's all of us on the ground, and it's especially the companies that are producing most of the impact on business, on the resources and humankind that have to change. So we believe the current model is largely based on, well, at least the idea that we have infinite resources, which we know today is wrong. It's not true, okay? It's a model that is super energy intensive, and if I had a curve to add to the list I showed, it's how we deal with energy. I'm sure some of you have seen this. Same shape, we're burning more and more and more. But the funny thing is that every time you add a new source of energy, what we do is not replace. What we do is not change. What we do is burn more. So there is something that doesn't work in the model. And in addition, when we produce and produce and produce, well, we don't only produce things we enjoy, we also produce waste. And the capacity of absorption of this waste is reaching the limit. So we do all that, usually, to maximize profits. And we need to ask questions around this. I think it is inevitable to ask the question of what is the purpose of business? And we got to move, I think, to thinking away from the good old shareholder value model and think about creating stakeholders' value. Businesses need to enhance their efficiency in terms of how they're consuming resources to which access will be more and more difficult. And you can't imagine moving to a circular economy without fundamentally reviewing the business model of a large number of businesses. So that's the point we're making in the paper. And doing that, well, we thought of the great man, Mr. Einstein, who apparently never said that, but I think the quote is so fantastic that I try to use it every time I have the opportunity. And one of the problems, I think, what he says is what we're trying to apply to corporate governance. We can't solve the problems that we have today by using the same kind of thinking as we used when we created these problems. So we have not only to change the business model, we have to change the way we think. That, I think, is how we embarked on this work and started by identifying a number of what I would call ideas, okay? It is a thought leadership paper. It's a discussion paper. We don't have recipes for you. We just have ideas to share. And we want to stimulate the debate with these ideas. So we don't think that we have to wait. We're grateful to have the European Commission and the OECD with us today. They will share their views on this paper. They've been doing, these two bodies in particular, I think, a lot of fabulous work on this issue. But if you go down and look at national level, our national politicians, I don't think they've all done a great job, because otherwise all these curves that we've seen, maybe they wouldn't have the same shape. And I don't think that companies and businesses need to wait, how long, by the way, for lawmakers and regulators to come up with ready-made solutions. That's just not going to happen. It hasn't happened so far. And we know what the problem is since more than 40, 50 years, and nothing has happened since then. So what, on the contrary, we've seen is quite a number, and a growing number, of businesses, CEOs and chairmen and boards, who have rolled up their sleeves and taken the issue very close to their heart and really starting to change. So that's what we're saying. We can't wait, and we believe that boards have a responsibility to act and change now. And we call this a public interest responsibility. Business will not become sustainable if boards don't decide that this is the way forward. So transforming the business model, I made the point, and new thinking needed. Well, that means that we really have to fundamentally review the composition of the board. And it's not only about having diverse, genders, generations, backgrounds on the board. Yes, this is utterly necessary, but there is more. I think we need new skills to address the new problems that we have. We also need And that, I think, is quite fundamental. We need different ways of thinking. So we need, I would say, different psychological profiles on a board. Not only people with different ties and colors of ties. Now, once the board is, we forgot it, Jyoti.
We forgot our
I'm
ties.
sorry. So once the board is composed, we have to think about what is the process that leads to selecting board members. There are many countries where I think we can make tremendous progress on how board members are being selected. Maybe we can think, and some leading companies are doing that, bringing a little bit more independence, subjectivity into the selection process. And we need to continuously reassess the functioning of boards. But against what target? And I think that's where the SDGs and the planetary boundaries that we come back to a number of times in the paper are important. This is the benchmark against which we need to also assess the performance of companies. So that means we really have to think in different ways, and we'll come back to these two things. So changing the board culture, I mentioned. Jyoti, you will stimulate a discussion as to whether people share the view that we really need a new public interest board culture. That means, or that has a number of very practical implications that we will have to explore further, for instance, on the reward system within a board. There are companies like a few banks. What is the name of this bank in South Africa?
Standard Bank.
Standard Bank, thank you. Who are using extremely impressive, actually, charts on which they base the reward of everybody from, the floor cleaner to the chief executive, using not only financial performance, but also ESG performance to actually reward people throughout the entire company. So that's where we need to move, but we need to move fast so that the change happens while it is still time. Now, one of the big points that we're making in the report also is that today companies, boards, have to transcend the boundaries of a business. So this is not only about the company itself, this is about engaging with stakeholders. A lot of businesses are doing that, but I think it is engaging with all stakeholders. It is also engaging with employees, with customers, with NGOs, and we have a collective problem that we can only solve collectively. So we believe that stakeholders' engagement is absolutely essential, not only for companies, actually also for regulators. And I think there is a conversation that needs to be had here. They need to transcend the boundaries of a business, looking at the impact of a business on society, mentioned. Maybe I forgot the taxpayers in there. They are the people who are picking up the price of negative externalities. And that's, I hope, more or less all of us in this room. So that is also a different view on stakeholders, because someone is picking up the price, okay? So stakeholders do include taxpayers, and looking at impacts on society, also looking at impacts on ecosystems. Again, the negative externalities that is basically screwing up the entire price system and therefore creates the wrong incentives across markets. And one of the things that is necessary today with the kind of global business system that we have developed and built, it is that companies do not close their eyes on what goes outside of the legal personality of a business. They have to outlook beyond the companies and take a perspective on the entire supply chain. There are a few countries, like my own country, where we sing the Marseillaise, that actually has been embarking on this route. And I think it is something that we really have to think about, because there are many countries out there who will not play their share. And in these countries, our companies are operating. So I think it is important that we take the lead, and that in a global market, we take a global perspective. Now, one of the points on which we're very clear, I think, in the report is that, yes, we believe corporate governance can make a real difference to these challenges that we have. However, it is certainly not a magic bullet. And it is not only companies who have to do their homework. I think if we want to really be successful on this, delivering on this collective challenge, well, policymakers and regulators have to do their bit as well. So we're sharing a number of ideas in this respect as well. I'm very interested to see what Xavier and Salla will have to say on that. But we believe that policymakers and regulators really have to change. And as we see a change moving away from shareholder value in companies, we don't really see the same change in many market supervisors and market regulators. They still think in terms of shareholder value, okay? So they too, I believe, have to start thinking in terms of stakeholders' protection, not only the protection of the immediate financial interest of investors. It's a different story we're living in. It's a different world. So we also believe that Europe has a fantastic leadership role that it's been playing, but that it needs to continue playing. And therefore, with this leadership role on the global stage, and what is the most integrated zone that we managed to preserve, whatever happened lately, well, I think it is important also that we really start thinking about consistency, that we start thinking about having a regulatory framework at European level for corporate governance. And we can't carry on with fragmentation across the 27, 28, whatever member states. And one role, and that's a conversation that we usually don't like to have, but we think that if we're to be successful, what is critically important is consistency also in enforcement. To my view, there's nothing worse than a piece of regulation that is not enforced. It is important for market integrity to protect companies that legislation is enforced actually effectively. But that requires really totally rethinking the role of regulators. So what seems to us when we were having conversations in this task force is that regulators think that their role is to regulate and regulate and regulate more and more. And that's what we've seen. I mean, the level of complexity of regulation has reached unprecedented level, which, by the way, also has an impact in terms of energy consumption, for instance. And I'm not only talking about intellectual energy here, but it is necessary that we simplify the regulatory framework in which we operate. And regulators will not do that alone. Regulators have to cooperate. And when I say cooperate, I think we're pretty clear in the task force that as in companies, we need to break the silos and make sure that marketing talks to finance, who talks to procurement, and etc., that we move to integrated thinking. I think it is also important that regulators cooperate amongst themselves in the same country, but also across country, and more importantly, with stakeholders. Again, we're all in this together, so regulators, to our belief in the task force, will not be able to just do their job if they stay in an ivory tower. They have to co-regulate with our stakeholders. And the basis to produce regulations should be impact assessment. But impact assessment that also is holistic and looks at the impact of regulation on markets, on biodiversity, on ecosystems, and on society. Because it is equally important to have everybody in society with us. So that, I think, should be one of the fundamental aspects of advancing regulation and rethinking the role of regulator. Enforcement, I mentioned, it is critical. And unfortunately, I think, many in business have started thinking in terms of cost-benefit. And that's not how you should think about enforcement. And if you think about enforcement in terms of risk and cost-benefit, well, then I think we need to be clear that the impact of sanctions and enforcement should deter you from doing the wrong thing. We need to be coherent, I think, with enforcement. And one of the critical roles that we see for regulators today is ensuring a level playing field. What do we mean by that? Well, there are a number of businesses who, on a purely voluntary basis, have been doing the right thing, I would say, for a number of years already. But what kind of incentive do we create if we collectively as consumers, but also regulators and policymakers, just tolerate that other businesses are doing just the opposite? I think it's great that business develop best practices and move ahead and innovate on how to do business in the 21st century. But we need to make sure that those who lag behind don't lag behind for too long. So one of the main roles of policymakers and regulators will be to make sure that some of the best practices become mandatory. Because if they're not mandatory, what will happen is that we're going to be creating incentives for those who kind of do not do the right thing to continue. And we're going to create a disincentive for those who are progressing in the right direction to continue doing so. We don't want to do that. And we believe that doing all that will require also a new approach to regulation. Regulators need resources. So they need financial resources, they need human resources, they need technology, they need resources to engage in cooperation with stakeholders, and we must give them these resources. So at the end of the day, one of the main conclusions that we reached was that it's all about integrated thinking. And you see here the diagram of the Integrated Reporting Council. Jyoti will talk about that. But we have to think about who we are ourselves. And it still mesmerizes me that today, here, we're a professional, and we forget that we're also a consumer, we're also an investor, we're also a parent. We all have these roles, and we seem to be schizophrenic on how we go about these roles. Well, we need to stop that. Otherwise, we will not resolve the challenge that we have. And to conclude on that, because I see Jyoti getting a little bit nervous, I think the points we're making in this paper is not about doing good. It's not about doing the right thing. It's about staying in business. That's what it's all about. And we have seen companies seeing their reputation harmed because of not doing the right thing. Moving forward, access to resources will become more and more difficult. It will have a financial impact. We already see that on companies having a number of stranded assets or investors stepping away from companies who are not considering, especially, for instance, banks not considering their impact on the energy sector. We see litigation arising. There are more than 1,000 case laws around in the world against multinational companies and against governments as well. So this is a real risk, all right, that is materializing. We need to deal with that. And for 40 years now, we've said there was something that we needed to do today for future generations. Well, I think that's over. It's our generation now that has to deal with that. So that's the challenge we're putting to you all in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Olivier, before you go, just one...
I was trying to escape.
I know, and I'm not going to just let you go. But actually, we probably won't have time to ask questions of you right now. But right through the day, I hope the questions that emerge from your paper will be ones that will be a challenge for us to face. When I was listening to you talk, and you can give me attention sometime whenever you're ready.
Apparently that's coming from Twitter.
Okay.
I was just checking.
Good. But when I was listening to you talk, you talked about so many things, and I made notes here. The move from shareholders to stakeholders, the need for businesses to transcend their boundaries, the need to understand that resources are actually limited. Now, for the last year, you and I have both been part of an integrated thinking group, and we've had about 50 businesses from around the world who've been telling us their challenges in dealing with this, and I think they would recognize all of that. What they seem to struggle with is that the system around them challenges them to step away from all of that and continue doing business as usual. How do you see this kind of report encouraging businesses to step away from business as usual, but to meet these challenges head on?
Well, I don't think, unfortunately, your report is doing that, to be very honest with you. I think what may help is a conversation you have around the report. What may help is how we start, changing the minds and encouraging more people, actually, to consider these issues. And that's what the report aims at doing. It is maybe seen as provocative by some, but I think our real purpose is to stimulate a conversation. And to get people, and I think that's especially difficult in this town in a way, where most of the conversations we have are really, business as usual. All regulation is going to cost a lot of money. Whole change is impossible. I mean, it's the same arguments all the time, basically. So I think one of the purposes of the report is to challenge the current status of the conversation. And by stimulating these debates, what we hope, and that's one of the key points, I think, in the report, that people will start putting their acts, in the same line as their thoughts, so that we can change. But if you look at the reports we've seen recently from the IPCC and from the biodiversity panel, we don't have a lot of time.
No, we don't. And I remember a conversation with the CEO of an insurance company from your country, actually,
Really?
and he was saying to me, we know as an insurance company that there are once in 100-year events, there are once in 500-year events, there are once in 1,000-year events, meaning they almost never happen. He says they now happen every other year.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what you think about whether change is happening. That change is happening outside, but is our business system changing to cope with that sort of change?
Well, in financial terms, it is actually changing. I think insurers, there are two kinds of people who are very, very aware of what's going on. It's the insurers and it's the military. When you look at the plans that the main armies of this world are drawing up to be ready when real catastrophic change happens, it is extremely impressive. When you look at the cost to insurers, I think the number for 2017 is something like 330 billion. I mean, this number 20 years ago used to be maximum 3 to 5 billion a year. I mean, there's a bit of a change here. And this is not change, about bees disappearing and, children crying because they can't play outside because of pollution. No, it's a real business financial issue. And that, I think, has changed. This issue used to be about doing good and protecting, things we like, and etc. No, today, this is a financial and vital issue. That's the change.
Super. Okay. It says time to debate, but actually it's not. We're going to be listening to some of the questions that
you do whatever you want with
the stuff. Okay. Before we do that, I just want to introduce to you a little video clip that we have received from Judge Professor Mervyn King, a South African who is widely regarded as the father of integrated reporting, has led much of the corporate governance reform that has happened around the world. And Mervyn has challenged accountants around the world to think about being chief value officers rather than being chief financial officers, because he wants the understanding that we're not here just to manage financial assets anymore, but we're here to think about value. And I sent Mervyn a note just to say, do you want me to say anything to introduce your video? And the one thing he said is, we don't just want an idea. If you have a vision, you got to translate it into action. And so he wants to see professionals, especially professional accountants around the world, buy into the idea of value rather than just thinking about financial assets. And he thinks that that's a training that needs to happen. So we're going to have a very quick segment here. It's just a brief video, 4 or 5 minutes long. And then I'm going to invite two of our representatives here to respond to the debate that they've been hearing, or at least the scene setting that was done by Olivier, to join the debate. So let's have the video from Professor Mervyn King. And I don't actually know how the video starts, but oh yeah.
Good day, everybody, and my apologies for not being with you personally today, but I wanted to talk to you about the concept of the Chief Value Officer. By the end of the 20th century, research showed that some of the iconic companies in the world on the great stock exchanges, only about 20% of its market value, or market capitalization, was in fact expressed as additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. These so-called intangible assets took on greater importance as we moved into the 21st century. In an endeavor to communicate about them, the Global Reporting Initiative was established and sustainability reporting started. The result of all that was a meeting eventually at the United Nations at the first decade of the 21st century, at which I was invited to be present, where inter alia, the International Federation of Accountants said it has to now be accepted that financial reporting in itself, although critical, is no longer sufficient to discharge the duty of accountability of a board of directors. I, at the time, was chairman of the Global Reporting Initiative and said, likewise, sustainability reporting has become critical in our resource-constrained world, but without numbers is quite meaningless. The discussion went further that companies were now starting to report in two silos, financial report and sustainability report. And that was divorced from reality, because as we all know, companies do not operate on a basis with financial capital in one building, human capital in another, intellectual property in another, for example. These things are integrated 24/7, as well as the relationships between the company and its stakeholders. All this led eventually to the establishment of the International Integrated Reporting Council, of which I became the chairman, and the issuing of our framework on how to think on an integrated basis and do an integrated report. So we moved, by the second decade of the 20th century, we moved from looking at value through only a financial lens, as we were taught the present value of discounted future cash flows, a comparative of book value to market value, by looking at things through a value creation process. What were the inputs into a company's business activities? How did it make its money? How did it make its product or render its service? And in doing so, what were the outcomes when it impacted on society? Had the corporate leaders of the company steered the business to the junction of the three critical dimensions for sustainable development, namely the economy, society, and the environment? The accountant, becoming the chief financial officer, was no longer sitting in a corner office drafting an annual financial statement according to financial reporting standards applicable to where his office was, but was becoming party in the C-suite to discussing this value creation process. And as time progressed, it became clearer that the accountant was the true change maker in this value creation process. The accountant, because of his or her public interest training, actually became the guardian of the value creation process in this discussion. Now, value was being looked at through a value creation lens, and because of this value creation process, the accountant was starting to look at things such as what was happening in the supply chain, what was happening from adequacy and effectiveness of controls, was there an informed oversight by the board, all things necessary to look at value creation in our resource-constrained world. Consequently, to continue calling him or her a chief financial officer was actually a misnomer. because the purview of what they had to do had broadened considerably with a value creation lens through which sustainable value creation was being looked at through companies. So it was more appropriate to call him or her Chief Value Officer, and consequently the book I wrote, Chief Value Officer, to express this thesis that with a value creation process in our resource-constrained world, the accountant plays an enormously important role, and he or she should rather be called the Chief Value Officer. Thank you very much for listening to me.
So we understand corporate governance largely in the context of how a business manages financial capital and how it relates to the people who provide that financial capital. Now we're seeing value being put in place, and this value is multidimensional, multi-capital, if you like, and it's bringing new challenges to corporate governance. And I think Olivier's report has set us down a path of thinking about how do we deal with this multidimensional, multi-capital challenge that boards now have to face when the past seemed quite clear. Let's just deal with profit. So to get us started with the debate side of things, I'm going to invite our two respondents to the paper. So we're going to have, and I'm going to invite you both to come up and join me here. So we have Salla Saastamoinen, who's the director at DG Justice and Consumers at the European Commission. And Salla, I'm going to encourage you to provide a European response, if you like, to the issues that are raised in the paper. And we also have Xavier Leflaive here, who is principal administrator at the OECD. And Xavier, we are keen to hear, do any of these ideas actually translate outside Europe, in Washington, D.C., in Beijing? Will anybody care about the ideas that are being talked about here? And perhaps you can give us a sense of the global thing. So right at the outset, I'd like to say to you both, just give us an immediate response. If there was one thing that you wanted to share from hearing Olivier's report, what would be your immediate response to it?
Okay, thank you, Jyoti. Thank you, Olivier, for the wonderful presentation and the great report. So thank you to the Accountancy Europe. The immediate thing is that it is really impeccable how our policies and thinking goes to the same direction. So the report comes to a moment when we are also, I think all the policymakers, whether then inside of the Commission, in the European Parliament, or in the Council here in the EU, we are thinking about the same matters. And that is, and one of those matters is the political priority of the sustainability. So this report is very topical. It brings food for thought for that discussion. The Commission had made its own reflection earlier this year with the report on it is a reflection paper on the sustainability. So we had put something in the paper in the table that was very much more general. This is now then going to the details on what we are discussing about the responsible business conduct and what we start to talk as a sustainable corporate governance. May I also mention that just today the new council presidency, that will be the Finland was next, they published their presidency priorities, and the whole name of it is Sustainable Europe, Sustainable Future. Mm-hmm. So that way, report goes to the same direction. It's very timely, and maybe as a third point, you said that okay, this has been thought and spoken earlier. Why hasn't anything happened? That was what you asked. I think it is really a realization that we are now talking about the more of an urgency, mm-hmm. so that we are talking with these all curbs going up there. It has come a real concrete to the policymakers also that we have to look at the matter. And maybe then to finish by saying that the report is interesting. It says what the boards should do, so what the companies should do, and then it talks about the regulators and policymakers. But for me and for us, these are not two different things. So it is indeed the combination of how the policymakers, meaning legislators, puts the framework to the companies so that there the boards will take their responsibilities. So that is something, so ideas that come from the report might be mentioned there under the board should take. Actually, there are some what also us as the preparators for legislation are thinking. But thank you for the report, so great work, thank you.
So I sense a welcome, that you are welcoming the ideas from the report, but it's already fitting into a context where there is work happening. And in fact, there was a question that came in on Twitter around the idea that Olivier had suggested. It said, is it wise to even contemplate having a Europe-wide corporate governance code? Cultures and expectations differ. Can we create something that is common? So I wonder if you could comment on that.
I wonder if we would call it a code. What I think that it is possible to contemplate a European-wide framework for the companies. So on the corporate governance. And framework in a sense that would consist of various parts, whether they are binding or non-binding recommendations, but that way still a common framework. And in the EU, we have already the habit of having the union level rules relating to corporate governance. The latest is the Shareholders' Rights Directive, or the actually revision of that one. So yes, it is possible to do some common things at the European level. And what I referred indeed in the beginning, that it is not only the Commission who is considering this, it is also the new European Parliament. You might remember that in the Parliament recently already made kind of shadow action plan for the responsible business conduct. There are the same people sitting in the new Parliament also, and actually in bigger groups in some, like now, for example, the Greens. So we know that there will be support on that side. And what I mentioned, that the other co-legislator, this is then the Council, it seems that they are setting also the priorities. So in our European level, this side is, I would say, ready to look at the matter. But naturally, it is not the very important part in the whole process, in the reflection, is all this debate with the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So without actually views of everybody here, and what we are also continuing actually this kind of the series of the stakeholders listening, it's not possible to do something common. So one needs the debate, one needs to talk about it, because naturally you said cultures have been different. That is also correct, but that means that actually what we need then to look what would be the best possible, or let's say best practices that where we can find still then a common understanding.
Could that end up being the lowest common denominator, or are we looking at doing some serious things here?
Well, I think that you started saying that we don't have anything now. So okay. That way, we are always higher. So that way, that means that yes, we are. What I think that we would be higher on that. Certainly, when the proposals, if any kind of proposals or plans come from the Commission, yes, we aim for an ambitious level. Okay. But there's a process. But what we need is also then to first to get the feedback from the stakeholders. I would say that it's interesting that when we go to the events like this, it sounds that there's 100% support. That means that we have businesses who are kind of front runners who say that yes, you have to work on this kind of the sustainable corporate governance. Sometimes I still have a feeling that is it really so that is everybody supporting? So are we also talking with those who will come maybe with that will it be a burden? Will it increase the costs? Isn't it so that still the market and money is the best way of actually guiding us in the free Europe? So I think that's why I say that it's important to talk with everybody and to listen all the arguments.
And I think those are great questions that will be emerging through today's conversation as well.
Also,
I certainly hope so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just to finish, maybe that we also see that maybe the businesses are a bit moving. We are doing very preparatory work now, meaning surveys and studies. And in our first results of our survey, looking at the due diligence in the supply chains and then the business and human rights, so covering sustainability very broadly. The majority of the business respondents, and we had more than 300 businesses interviewed, the majority of them was supporting common work at the European level going forward.
Okay, that's great to hear. Xavier, there's a microphone for you. Salla, thank you for your comments. We will come back and ask you some questions now, and I hope you'll be happy to take them. Xavier, you are now in a role where you're exploring what happens to companies at the OECD, the ideas around where companies should go, etc. But you come to this with a background in doing over a decade's work in environmental issues. So presumably some of the issues that Olivier is talking about, you already are deeply familiar with them, but how would your business department at the OECD welcome these ideas?
Well, thanks. Obviously, you know too much about my background. It's true that I just spent 15 years at the OECD in the Environment Directorate, and I'm just shifting now towards the Directorate, which is working on corporate governance, responsible business conduct, anti-bribery, integrity, I mean, that kind of issues. And I think, indeed, I can contribute to ensure that the environmental issues that were forcefully mentioned in the presentation can be reflected at board level. But still, I would like to propose a slightly different perspective, because obviously environment, climate, these are global issues, and there is a role for firms and corporate governance to address them. I fully sympathize with the point that corporate governance can help rethink and redo the way we do business and making, putting firms on a more sustainability pathway. For development. But still, there is another global conversation that I would like to suggest. It's the matter of trust. Trust in business. We know, if you look at the Edelman barometer or similar tools, that trust in business is at historically low. And we think this is an issue because trust is a condition for action. There is no way firms can deliver and meet the expectation from civil society, their customers, and other stakeholders if we can't restore trust in business and the way they operate and they relate to global issues. So, to me, that's a critical element of sustainability. Not so much, obviously, from a strictly environmental perspective, but it's a precondition for taking action. And this is a conversation that goes globally. The trust issues are being measured in a wide range of countries, including India, China, and the like. And that's why at the OECD we are setting up a new initiative called the Trust in Business Initiative, where we look into how corporate governance, responsible business conduct, anti-bribery, integrity, policies can contribute to restore trust in the business, in corporates and in the business environment. Because again, this is a condition for action. This is a condition for business and governance to be able to take action and deliver on whatever goal they set at a larger scale. So I think this is a critical issue, and it somehow changes a little bit the perspective, because although I fully acknowledge the relevance of sustainability and environmental issues, I think this issue of trust changes a little bit the conversation. And on that, I would like to add one more perspective, is that if you approach corporate governance from a sustainability perspective, there is a risk that it's somehow too broad. And one suggestion I would like to make is to approach it from a more precise or better defined perspective, which is the concept of purpose. And Olivier, you mentioned to that, what's the purpose of the firm? And I think there is a very interesting conversation going on in a number of OECD countries about the purpose of the firm, how it could be defined, designed, but in quite a narrow sense, because if it's defined more narrowly, more precisely, it can be the basis of a commitment. And a commitment of the firm to deliver on a particular purpose, I think that's a condition to restore trust and to actually contribute to some form of sustainable development. And I think this issue of having a more precise, more specific definition of the purpose of my firm can actually drive decisions or reflections about the corporate governance. Who are the stakeholders? Who should be brought into the conversation? How are we going to arrange the governance of my particular corporation to make sure that these people who are involved in that particular purpose, who have a say, are part of the conversation. This will drive also discussions about the definition of performance for my firm, the metrics, how you measure that. You talk about integrated reporting. Integrated reporting, in principle, is a very good idea. But there is a risk that it tries to embrace a lot of things. And I think if you take sustainability in a too broad way, there will be trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the key also concepts I would like to propose for the conversation, which is not in the report, but I trust you could factor it in, is this idea of trade-off. In principle, I fully support this idea of integrated thinking, collegial operation of boards, which are well defined as proposal in the document. But we can't be naive, and obviously at some point, integration has some limits. Collegiality has some limits, and at some point you will face different perspectives, different views, different ambitions, different priorities. And so the question is, how do you organize these trade-offs? Same thing for the concept of value. The value creation does not operate simply by adding up values. Sometimes you have to make choices, and creating value in one direction may affect the capacity to create value on another dimension. So again, this idea, this concept of trade-offs, I think should play a more prominent role into any discussion about corporate governance and how it's going to evolve to capture a more diverse set of dimensions or priorities. And to address these trade-offs, I think a key solution is this idea of deliberation. How do you arrange a dialogue, a multi-stakeholder dialogue in boards or in other dedicated committees? And here, we don't know how this can best be organized, but I think this is an avenue for further discussion and research when we think about responsible business conduct, corporate governance, as drivers towards sustainability or as drivers to restore trust in business communities. Ultimately, it all boils down to this idea of how do you organize deliberation between different stakeholders, which may have diverging priorities, diverging concerns. Ultimately, there will be a political dimension here, a matter of a power play. So how do you organize this conversation between different stakeholders? That's probably one area where the report could be more concrete or may provide some more practical suggestions on how to organize this deliberation.
Fantastic. So I'm listening to you and thinking you've raised the issue of trust, you've raised the issue of purpose, and you're talking about trade-offs. And to me, those are business decisions that have to be, those are business issues that boards should be on top of. And you did describe the issues raised in Olivier's thing as kind of perhaps being more sustainability-led. But I suspect Olivier, and you can defend yourself in any way you want, but if I was to speak for him, I'd say perhaps the sustainability issues that he's talking about are bringing the whole system to a particular state where the issues of trust and the issues of purpose and the issues around trade-offs are actually very material issues to deal with. How do you feel about that?
I fully agree, but I mean the point is that again, sustainability will raise trade-offs. No one will agree on I mean, the assumption that we can reach a consensus on where the priorities should be and where we should put our money, investment, technology, etc. I think that does not reflect reality. In reality, there will be trade-offs. One word we haven't discussed so much shareholders in detail. Even shareholders, they don't agree among themselves. Shareholders, the more I work with them, the more I realize they're a very diverse community. And what will be a priority for a particular group of shareholders may be a minor preoccupation for another. Short-term, long-term, etc., etc. So that's why you have to acknowledge that the stakeholders and the broader the scope, the more diversity you bring into the conversation, the more trade-offs you'll have to face. And so ultimately you have to question and make sure that you have a governance arrangement that will be able to document, inform, but also address these trade-offs.
And do you think that in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing, they would care about this?
Well, are you talking about boards or governments?
Both. An integrated view.
I think boards global. As you said, obviously there is a risk that we talk to the same people, the same community. We are preaching the converted. So we want to make sure that we reach out to a larger group of industries and corporates, so that really the message spreads over. But still, my sense is that boards really understand this issue in most countries, because, as Olivier said, it's not just a matter of being good or doing good, it's a matter of staying in business. And there is a very, again, powerful player here, which are shareholders. All these movement towards disclosure, but climate risk, how much your company is exposed to climate-related risks or now to water-related risks. This is a key issue for shareholders, because they want to understand how much they are exposed. Their portfolio, how much their portfolio is exposed to risk. So that really urges firms to disclose, to share more information about, to do the analysis and share that information. And of course, based on that, they will take action. So I think boards here are fully aware about these issues. What I hear from talking from some of them is that, again, some shareholders may push them into one direction, whereas others may push them in another direction. So again, how do you deal with proxy advisors? How do you deal with that diversity of shareholders who may have conflicting views and conflicting priorities? So even if CEOs are well aware, they still need to put in place the mechanism, the governance arrangements that will help them address these conflicting priorities. When it comes to governments, to be transparent, I don't think there is a consensus, at least among OECD member states, which are the ones with whom we engage more systematically. And that's why we set up this Trust in Business initiative, which develops outside of our regular committees or working parties to explore new avenues, new ideas. And we hope that within the next 2 or 3 years, these new ideas can actually inform a discussion in our regular working parties and committees, which are really spearheaded by our member states. But frankly, at that moment, you have, just to give a few examples, my own country, France, just passed a law called Loi Pacte. I'm sure Olivier is familiar with it, which actually promotes this concept of purpose, encouraging firms to define their purpose and to set up a governance mechanism to report on how much they achieve, how much they converge towards that purpose. So I think this is typically a government that is seeing some value and which is taking action. In the UK, you have a very interesting program by the British Academy called The Future of the Corporation, which goes exactly in the same direction. In the US, you have 35 states in the last 10 years which have endorsed the B Corp statuses for firms, so that firms can explicitly acknowledge that profit is one of the main objectives, but they will also dedicate resources to other purposes. So I think a number of governments are realizing that there is an issue here. There is room to improve the way firms are governed, and there is rooms to improve the regulatory framework that will drive change into that direction, but we haven't reached a consensus yet. And yeah, so that's why we count on you, we count on the European Commission, we count on the members of the member countries of the European Union to work with the OECD to promote these issues, make them even more prominent, so that ultimately we can really reach a consensus in a wider community and adjust our tools, our principles, typically for responsible business conduct or for corporate governance, so that they are better aligned with the expectations of our communities.
All right. Well, thank you for the answers there. It's your chance. This is your chance to make comments, agree, disagree, ask questions, seek clarifications, whatever. So if you would like to ask a question, then I'll identify you, or rather I'd ask you to identify yourself. And so just tell us who you are and then go ahead and ask your question. However, we do have a microphone that needs to get to you. So I hope we have a microphone ready to go. Excellent, we do. Okay, so there is a question here in the middle. If you can get the microphone across. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Christophe Claire, Descartes Legal, I'm a lawyer. Actually, I have two comments. One for the report by Accountancy Europe, which I think is a great concept, idea, project. However, I feel a little bit that you have very carefully described how the house we all live in is burning. And the proposal at the end resembles a little bit something like, here is a glass of water. So I would be interested to know if you think you've gone as far as you would like to, or if you have felt constrained by the fact that representing and working with companies, you needed to make what was described as trade-offs. And again, I think it's very good, but I feel that if we really think about it, considering what you have described, even if everything you have proposed is implemented, I'm not sure that this would really significantly help. So that's my first question. My second question is for the Director Saastamoinen. You've been very careful in your presentation, describing that there is an ongoing process of thoughts, which I think is very good. But I will also have a bit more thought-provocative question for you. I think that in the last 20 years, the European Commission has said basically that every issue relating to corporate governance was due to the fact that shareholders did not have enough powers. So we've had for 20 years programs increasing the power of shareholders. The result is shareholders have taken the power and asked to have basically more dividends, which is very logical. Maybe it's time to rethink the whole process and acknowledge that maybe something was flawed in the concept. Thank you.
So a couple of excellent questions. Olivier, do you want to... well, why don't you? Since I suspect some of the questions are going to be addressed to you anyway.
Well, maybe the first question at least, and it's interesting that you start by quoting President Chirac, right? The house is burning, but I think his answer to your question was, we're looking in the other direction. So at least we're bringing a glass of water, maybe start of the answer. I would disagree with you, if I may, and agree as well at the same time. There is no good answer to the huge systemic crisis that we're facing. However, I think one of the fundamental proposals that we're perhaps in a too timid way putting on the table is that businesses have to change their business model, i.e. we need to move away from the idea of maximizing sales and using things like planned obsolescence, aggressive marketing, selling more and consuming more. Is that lacking ambition? Is that realistic is the question I was expecting. And I think it's not realistic, but the issues we're facing are real. So we will have, and we all sense now, I think Salla was very right, that a sense of urgency was starting to build up, even with policymakers who so far felt pretty protected from the issue. They don't have to cross the Mediterranean Sea. Well, now they start being afraid that they will also have to bear the consequences. So I suppose regulation will also play its role, and pressure will also rise on business. We're at the beginning, in a way, of a change process that needs to happen very quickly. But if we do change, if a large number of companies do change their business model, I think we will start on the path of systemic change. On the second point, I think I will let Salla answer, and I will exit the scene. But I think it is a very, very valid point.
There is a seat
Okay.
waiting for you.
I think it's a very valid point, because I don't think shareholders have been playing their part personally. And if you look at the number of shareholders today that basically are algorithm, that are just making trade-offs in milliseconds, how do you want to rely on such a machine to make a mindful decision that takes into account the long-term survival of humankind? I can't see that happening.
It is correct that we have been working indeed much on the shareholders so far, and what we have, the latest one, now the recast of the Shareholders' Rights Directive, was there to engage more also the long-term shareholders, of making it more transparent and trying to activate them actually to show their views. What we had a problem that we had such an investors who were not actually at all active in the decisions of the companies, who left the general assemblies to the others, and indeed functioned only with a quick money. But what we have tried, we have aimed to make actually a system where also we are engaging them more. It is also that we are looking at this trends, what was said, that we are looking at the trend, for example, on what is the interest of the company. You mentioned the purpose of the company. This was something that was discussed also precisely on the negotiations of the Shareholders' Rights Directive, where there were some who said that the interest of the company is only the interest of the shareholders, but there were already the member states who said that no, the interests are broader. They are broader of the company, or even that broader. And that is then what we see that some of the member states are currently doing, that there are some examples of those who are going further. And in the EU, as we are trying to think what is let's say sufficient level also of this level playing field, this is an aspect that we are currently studying. So we are studying from the company law perspective what should be the company's, how we are defining the company's interest. So whether that is broader than the shareholders' interest or not. And our our way of working is that we are taking it that way cautious, that it won't change it from this day to another. The European Union is functioning, I mean, it's always that we use it, the big wheel. It takes a long time, but if the direction is right, it can bring then the 28 countries so far with it. And that's then that's really then the advantage. So not only these individuals who are thinking of this matter, but if we are skillful and we have an engaging attitude then towards all stakeholders, we can bring it to the European level. There was also something that you said, Xavier, about this long-termist, short-termist. So this is also something what is here related. And we think indeed that we would need to add incentives for this more long-term thinking, the long-termism in the companies. And that is also then we have to look what is there the role of the board, what are the incentives for the board, are there incentives other ways. And I would And for the companies, this is very important, naturally, because if the company's thinking and the board thinking is very short term, we are in Europe losing with the research and investment and training in the companies, which are very important for the European companies actually to be successful in the longer term. So yes, we are talking about the sustainability, but it's not only, I mean, it's not so that yes, we do good. We do something, we want that the Europe is an innovative place. That is actually, and that means that our companies will need to also have the resources for that one. And we know that Europe can change, by the way. You started from the circular economy. Currently, this commission, the Juncker Commission, has done a specific bigger policy on that one, and currently there are no waste going outside of the Europe. I've yesterday been in the occasion where this was discussed by our highest leaders. So what we have managed to change in 5 years is that we have created a circular economy, and this is also then for our companies. And about this being in contact with the stakeholders, what I would like to say that about the short-termists and long-termists, the EBA has launched day before yesterday a public consultation about it. So if you are interested in that, it talks, for example, about the impact to the remuneration. Please use the search engine and find that public consultation, and that is also one way of giving your views on this item. And by the way, this action is also under the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and that is what we are then currently implementing while waiting the new commission to take its office, and naturally the new commission then to make it confirm those policy lines that we hope that will follow indeed naturally from the European Council that confirmed its strategic priorities last weekend.
Well, thank you for that full answer to that question, which presumably gets some of you thinking as to where Europe is going on this. But Xavier, can I just ask you, we have been seeking to protect the rights of shareholders for some time, so it's not a surprise they're now saying this is what we want. Is it realistic that we could talk about stakeholder protection, stakeholder rights in a global context? Is that a conversation that is going to go anywhere?
Well, first I'd like to clarify, this is not new. I mean, typically the OECD principles on corporate governance, they have a chapter on stakeholder engagement. Mm-hmm. And again, these principles have been endorsed at G20 level. So they really have some sort of a global reach, if you like. So now, to be transparent, and that's if you quote me,
you just lose your mic.
It was great that the mic was off.
It's good risk management.
Now, I think it's fair to say that in the principle there is some asymmetry in the OECD principles on corporate governance. There is some asymmetry between the rights of shareholders and the interest or the role of stakeholders. I think these are the exact wording which are used. Fine, that may reflect the state of mind, that was prevalent maybe 10 years ago. I think there is room for maybe some improvement.
Yeah, why don't we try this?
Thanks. So I think here there may be room for some improvements, and that's why we set up this Trust in Business initiative to explore these new ideas and see how then they can inspire new work, new discussions in typically the working party or the committee that oversee the development and potentially the update of these principles. So that conversation is not new. It probably needs to be revived and put at another scale. I think these issues of firms making a commitment. You can call it purpose, can use other words, there may be other concepts. I'm not saying this is the silver bullet, but firms making commitment and arranging their governance structure so that they will deliver on these commitments. I think this is an interesting way forward. This is a way to bring stakeholders into the discussion and to think about how you, again, organize the trade-offs or the deliberation between boards and shareholders and other type of stakeholders. There are concrete examples. I don't know if we have time to move into that.
Well,
but maybe
let's
at a later
see if we
stage.
can get a couple more questions, and then we'll go from there. So we have 2 questions here, okay? And you have the mic already, and you've got a third. All right, well, let's see how we fare. Okay, go for it.
First of all, thank you very much for this thought-provoking debate. And Olivier, I'm Elizabeth Florence from EY. Olivier mentioned that the business model needs to be changed, and fully agree. That being said, we also need to see what the customers want. And what the customers want can be reflected in public consultations. We already see that there is more interest in what's happening at EU level. There were more people voting at the EU elections. People are interested in to see who is going to be the next president. And I was just wondering if you see any trends, how to involve more the wider public, and how to invite them to share their views during public consultations.
Okay, so we've got a question here on shareholders, and there's another question here. Yes?
Thank you. Katrien Rennemeyer, I work as an independent CSR consultant, and for me, and this is my personal opinion because I can represent very much my personal opinion today, business as usual is not just about exploiting the environment, but also exploiting human lives. And I don't think I have to explain that. I think there are systems in the world that, ensure some people make a lot of money off of the backs of other people being poor and their human rights being violated. And I'm wondering whether if we go into a new direction in terms of corporate governance, how that discourse can also be opened up to talk about the lack of institutional governance, or weak institutions in developing countries, because a lot of the, let's say, the exploitation that happens is because of weak governance institutions in developing countries. Those governments not being able to protect the rights of their people, or being able to uphold environmental laws, etc. So I wonder whether, if we go into a new direction in terms of talking about corporate governance at this level where power is concentrated, how will we open up that debate to also get those boards to talk about weak governance institutions in developing countries, and the fact that, that is business as usual. It's taking advantage of corruption, it's taking advantage of human rights negligence. So.
Okay, very good question, thank you. And Andrew, you've got a question.
Yeah, Andrew Hobbs from EY, I'm one of the panelists later on. I've got 2 questions. One is, in terms of trade-offs and different companies' business models, it will remain the case that some companies don't have long-term business models because either they can't or they don't want to. Is it really a case of applying one size fits all, or is it a case of being very clear about which is which? So that's the first question. And the second question is about, if we think about the mega trends in the world, of which climate change is one, but I'm also thinking about changing demographics, rapid developments in technology, and globalization. Can regulators and policymakers keep up? And if they can't keep up, what does their approach need to be to drive the agenda that we're talking about today?
Okay, so I'm going to stop the questions there for now, because we've got, how do we make sure the consumer, the citizen is being cared for? We've got what happens to the institutions and the weakness of the institutions in developing countries in particular to protect the social rights of people. And then we've got Andrew's question around business models and long-term, is that realistic for all kinds of companies? Salla, would you like to get us started on this, please?
Okay, I'll start. About the first one, that how can we see that what the clients want? So actually I put that then question to the consumers, as we are in our DG, we are in charge about both justice and consumer matters. And what we see in the consumers, naturally, that the consumers are also becoming more conscious on the sustainability. That's then I would say that it is much on the with the reference to the climate and environment. and that they want more information. What we also see still that the behaviors haven't changed so much as the views also in the consumers. So this is our latest consumer condition scoreboard. It's actually only coming now in a couple of months, but that says that the people want more information. They are ready to demand the products and the services who are taking into account the climate action and environmental issues. But the change on the consumer's behavior is not yet so big. So maybe this discrepancy is then going forward. So the demand side, but I would still conclude the demand side starts to be there. Then a question about how we are reacting, or how should it be the businesses who are reacting to the weak governance on the third countries? Well, if we have in some areas we have created the more regulated due diligence system for the supply chain, like the conflict minerals aspect of timber. So this is something that EU has looked at it, but naturally that doesn't, for me and for us, it's not really that the companies are responsible of the weak governance. I would say that this is more a public policymakers and legislators. So when, for example, the European Union, which is currently the largest donor of the world in the development aid, that when we are looking at more in the system that our donation, our aid is linked or requires improvement of the governance also in these third countries. I would see that this is actually more the way. It's kind of it is between the state level rather where the responsibility lies, and that is something that we are also doing. So we are mainstreaming actually then the demand to have the governance, less corruption, which is then also naturally means more effective use of our aid to the third countries. So that is something how we are dealing with. We are not so much in general dealing and saying that yes, companies should be in charge and they shouldn't go to the countries. That hasn't been yet still so far in our policies. Although the new trade agreements do have some clauses that ensure also the taking into account the situation of the human rights and social affairs in the other countries. And then it was the last one that can the regulators can we keep us in speed on these fast changes? I think that we have certain regulatory techniques that helps us to keep somewhat in the space, which means that if we are having the rules on more in the general level of the principles of the goals, and then have the second level, third level rules that can be changed faster, and that way of reacting actually in the speedier way. But I still stress that still what we found, and I think that the best way of handling is still the democracy. So if we have a legislative processes that take time, we also have to actually take that in the bargain, because then in the long term we have this the ownership of everybody, and that is something naturally which is sometimes the legislative processes take long time in the national level, but certainly here in the EU. We have taken that into account.
And Xavier, would you just talk about the idea that Andrew was also referencing, which is that not every company has a long-term business model, whereas here some of the issues are long-term versus short-term?
Yeah, before I go to that, I would like to, if I can, I think the point about businesses operating in a weak institutional environment is really critical. The OECD has developed a tool, you may be familiar with it, called the EMEIA guideline, the Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which is the only code of conduct, if you like, for responsible business conduct, which is endorsed by governments, meaning that governments commit to facilitate the implementation of the EMEIA guidelines. And governments have set up what we call a national contact point. Typically, if you're an NGO active in Bangladesh and you realize a French, German, Italian company in Bangladesh or US company, so a company which originated in a OECD member country, does not behave according to the EMEIA guidelines, you can actually go to the national contact point in France, the US, or Canada, and take action. And the national contact point has a mandate to actually investigate that case, investigate that situation, and potentially ask the company to change its behavior or to take more severe action. So there is a mechanism. It has its strengths and weaknesses, but at least there is a mechanism in place, and this is really something we would like to advertise further, because that can potentially be a very powerful tool for any NGO in the world interacting with a company that originates in an OECD member country to take action and to promote a more responsible business conduct. Now, if a firm doesn't have a long-term view, I mean, that's fine. Again, here the idea is not to mandate or impose any particular model, but I think it would be very interesting if that information becomes available, and that the firm somehow explicitly says, I don't commit to a longer-term perspective because that's not in my business plan. Fine, but it would be, I would encourage the firm to say it explicitly. And if you have a governance arrangement that urges the firm to make that, announcement, fine. But we'll see. I mean, this may have consequences on, its capacity to access capital, human resources, and others. So.
Okay, we do have more questions, but we've got a debate that's coming up, and so hang in there and let's join in there. We're going to bring this bit to a close, but before I say thank you to both of you, I did warn you, I was going to ask you one question. Is there anything that you've picked up today that makes you think, when you go back to work tomorrow, here's something we're going to have to work on? So Salla, can I ask you that first?
I have a feeling that nowadays it's every day that we are working with the sustainability, because we are, and also this aspect and corporate governance, because we are preparing for the next commission as a civil servants. We do a lot of background work, and actually, so today it was this one, and tomorrow we have already a policy design meeting with our teams. Actually, I have a great team here. Can you say hello there so that everybody knows who is from the Commission?
Hello.
Yes, hello. So there's afterwards we have a reception, so you can just talk to my colleagues there also.
Put your hand up again, yes, so that people can come and talk to you.
Yes.
All
because
right.
Tomorrow,
go and find them.
Because tomorrow we will have indeed a policy design meeting, a small seminar where we are thinking where we go forward, and for example, then the report is one of our inputs for our talks.
Fantastic. That sounds like a very practical thing. And Xavier, what about you? Is there something you want to share with us?
Yeah, 2 quick points. Maybe the first one, I mentioned this Trust in Business initiative. Yep. The inaugural meeting of the initiative will be on October 1st and 2nd in Paris. And I'll do 2 things. One, make sure some of the issues that we have discussed here will be on the agenda. And I will also make sure that you are invited. I mean, typically, I think the work that the accountancy profession at European level is putting together is very relevant. That leads actually to a question back to you, if I may. Mm-hmm. What about governance of your profession and your business? I mean, typically, I think there are very interesting questions to be raised about the governance of professional services and the kind of advice that they have provided to firms in the last 20 years. I know my first employer was Deloitte. So I sympathize. And seriously, I fully subscribe to what you said, that your profession has a decisive role to play in this debate. So now, taking stock of what the role has been in the past maybe 20 years or more, how is that role going to change and evolve in the coming decades? And that begs some questions on, typically ESG criteria for the management of accounting firms or other professional services. Think about law firms, proxy advisors, all these, management industry, if you like, that contributes to driving firms in a particular direction.
Fantastic. We're going to stop for a coffee break. But Olivier, you're really being challenged on this, isn't it?
I think I need to respond to this.
I think you need to respond to this question.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Xavier for bringing the challenge back to where it came from. I think that's very good. And that's also one of the purposes of this paper. We're not only, I think, with all the work that we do at Accountancy Europe, talking and engaging with stakeholders, but we're also challenging ourselves. And I think the point you're making is very important not only for us, but for all businesses in professional services or outside in industry. The conditions under which we operate are changing very, very, very fast. And what we used to say, believe, and advise to do just 5 years ago is now seen as not necessarily fully appropriate. And that's the world in which everybody is operating today. So I think whatever is your industry sector, you have to ask yourself, what is my responsibility in 5 years' time on what I'm doing and saying today? So coming back to the long-term thing, I don't really believe it's a long-term issue anymore. It is a very short-term issue. Things are changing by the year in a way. So this is the kind of timescale we now need to have in mind, and seeing how we're going to be judged for what we say and do, not only today, but also in a couple of years' time. And it may be quite different. Look at how young people are moving very, very fast in their demands on this agenda. That's what we need to be ready for.
Super. Sounds like all three of you have got something to do tomorrow. So yeah. I'm pleased for that. I wonder if you join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have you.
And if you're feeling warm, this is going to be a chance to get a drink, to take advantage of the facilities here. We'll be back in 15 minutes. So let's try and do this as quickly as possible. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you've had an opportunity to get some refreshment, and we're going to start now. The idea of this particular session is really for us to have a conversation amongst each other, one that I hope you will contribute to immensely. It's your questions that really need to drive this. We've got some people here who are representing different parts of the corporate governance space, and they have got their views on what they think about the report and the ideas that have been talked about, and I'm going to invite them to share their views. And because this is a debate that we're all taking part in, they're not coming up to the front to do it. We're just going to invite them to share their views from where they are. I'm going to invite them to stand up and introduce themselves and give a very brief response to what they've heard. You know, one thing that they really feel this is a positive thing we've heard from the discussion we've already had, from the report that I hope they've all read. I want to hear one thing from them. It could be that maybe there's something they really disagree with. And so to help them get started, I know there were a number of questions, people amongst you who were trying to get my attention to say, I want to ask a question too. So before we invite them to start, I'm going to put a few minutes aside just to give you the chance to say something. And I don't want it to be a long question or a long commentary, but perhaps one thing that you think you'd like the debaters to be considering and to think about. So does anybody here have a question or a comment you want to make, a brief comment that you think is a perspective you want discussed in this debate? Yes, sir. So do we have any spare microphones here? Yeah, fantastic. Go ahead.
Alberto Bagnara from Guberna, the Belgian Institute of Directors. Quick questions: how not only the business model but the board model will evolve to embrace all the topics that we've been discussing today.
So not just the evolution of the business model, but does the board model need to change? Okay, that's a question that I hope you folks will be paying attention to. Any other questions or comments, agreements, disagreements here? No? Okay. Well, maybe they'll emerge as we start going through this discussion. So we have here a number of people to spark our debate and the questions that we might want to ask. And I've got here, as a panel, Florence Bindelle, who's the Secretary General of European Issuers. So welcome, Florence, and we're going to be hearing from you. We have Michel de Fabiani, who's the Chairman of the Policy Committee at EcoDa, Aleksandra Palinska, who's a Senior Regulatory Policy Advisor at EFAMA, and Andrew Hobbs, yes, present, partner, the EMEIA Public Policy Leader at EY, and Sebastien Godinot, economist at the World Wildlife Fund. So we have different perspectives that we're going to be hearing from in this conversation. And Florence, I wonder if I can get you to start us in this process. I'd like your reaction to what you've heard, to the report. What do you think? Yes, no, black or white?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting panel. Thank you for the report as well. As EuropeanIssuers, we believe that corporate boards are the drivers in the transition of the sustainable economy. And the motion that was put forward for the debate says that a radical change of our economic paradigm seems necessary and urgent. EuropeanIssuers, they would agree that yes, there will be a change, but it won't be radical. Why? This is because European corporates already take an interest in the wider environmental impact of their activities, and vice versa. They are already, and it's mentioned in the page 5 of the report, integrating ESG factors as a part of their competitiveness and growth strategy. The non-financial reporting directive and the non-binding guidelines on climate-related reporting are encouraging even more companies to take into consideration ESG factor and their impact on the environment. In addition to that, European issuers also agree about the long-term vision. It is necessary to ensure sustainability of activities and also a transition to a sustainable economy. However, we would like to drive an attention to a trend which is increasing today in Europe. It's shareholder activism. In some forms, it forced boards to overly focus on short-term financial performance, and it was basically addressed previously in the discussion. And aiming for the short-term profit of a company, it could eventually undermine it to the benefit of external interest, and therefore against collective and social interests that should prevail. Overall, though, European issuers does not think it's necessary to clarify the rules according to which directors are expected to act in the company's long-term interest and to develop legislation on that respect for different reasons. Many corporate codes, and maybe it answers also the question that was raised by the Belgian representative of Godinot, are already taking in consideration that issue and are recommending the board of directors to promote long-term value creation, and the recent code of the Belgian authorities can demonstrate that, and to take into consideration the environmental aspects on their activities. So flexibility through self-regulation is still really important. Companies are also increasingly involving stakeholders through different forms of dialogue, including stakeholders committees with various composition, purpose, which allow a discussion on the new challenges of companies and the ones that are facing in sustainable finance. As already mentioned, they incorporate the ESG factor in their business strategies, but also in their reporting. I remind you that the non-financial reporting directive obliged companies to describe due diligence procedure in their supply chain, addressing the risk linked to the company's operation and their business relationship. Therefore, before engaging in a new policy action, an assessment should be made on the provision and good practices that already exist in many member states. Such an assessment, which I understand is partially ongoing, thank you very much, will allow the policymakers to decide whether there is evidence or failure or a necessity to really act. So to finish my comment, corporate governance is an issue for companies of all sizes, but the size does matter. SMEs do have a role to play in the transition to a more sustainable economy. Many have an impact on the environment and exist as the part of the supply chain of larger economies. However, it's necessary to consider the constraint that SMEs are facing, which makes it even more important to consider a proportionate approach. And I'm happy to elaborate further on these main comments. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you, Florence. Basically, a challenge which says, yes, change is coming, but it's not going to be radical because we've already been on this path for some time and there are good practices happening. You may or may not agree with that, so keep that in mind. But we're going to hear another one, Michel de Fabiani. So Michel, can you give us your response to this paper?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. First thing I want to say is that I disagree with line 4. So I was very disappointed when I started to read the executive summary. Usually you read only the executive summary in a document.
Could you remind us what
in
line 4 is? Some of us
it
have
says, corporate governance is therefore instrumental. It is no longer about doing good and making the world a better place. It is about staying in business. First, I'm surprised you say corporate governance has been about doing good and making the world a better place, and has not been about staying in business. I would change the sentence if Olivier allows me to propose. It will be about doing good and making the world a better place. It will even more be, and indeed, about staying in business. There might be a slight difference of perception. Okay, this being said, now a few points. First, I have to say, as representing the directors, the members of the board, I should claim for 35 minutes of discussion because more than half of the report is about boards and directors. But I I'm not a fan of proportionate representation. I will just keep with 5 or 6 minutes. The directors are the doers. We are the doers of all what has been written and suggested and recommended and what the policymakers will give us. So, my first thing I have done recently, and because I was asked to give a sentence, and I discussed that with Beatrice, who is the Director General of EcoDa, and with some members of our board. It's not yet official because I need to have the blessing of 26, 28 countries, so you know what it means. I think for companies, I think boards should ensure the company creates value for its shareholders and its relevant stakeholders in a sustainable way. And as a director, as a board member, I would live comfortably with that framework or that ambiance. Now, a few considerations. First, don't remember that if there is no shareholder, there is not even a company. Whether it's a state, a state with one shareholder, a cooperative with a multitude of shareholders, companies need shareholders first. Then, if there is no stakeholder, there is no activity. You can create a company, but it doesn't work. The first stakeholders are the employees. And it's not by surprise that employee representation is becoming more and more compulsory, and even, I would say, more and more palatable, even for those who don't like it. Then we have a series of stakeholders who are relevant to a company. Obviously, if you have no customer, you can have employees, you can produce, you can sell, but you cannot sell, sorry, so you stop. If you have no suppliers, same. And then you have what I call the geography, which is the environment where you operate, whether it's a village, whether it's a city, whether it's a region, whether it's a country, or a huge area. Now, the point, there are a few words which I've not heard this afternoon, sorry. One is technology. I think it was mentioned 1 or 2 times. And I think technology is becoming the tool for sustainability. If you think of climate change, carbon treatment, electricity production, education with new technology, health with revolution of technology in hospitals, companies have to consider the use of technology within their own activity. The second word, which was not mentioned very much, is the word risk. I think I heard it 1 or 2 times. I think risk is the starting point of everything. Boards have to analyze risk in a much more detailed and permanent way than they did in the past. For me, the past is 10 years ago. Boards, like in every field, the leaders do more than the others. And there are boards who are leaders, companies who are leaders, they do more than the others. And in companies where we are leaders, the board looks at risks, not just from yesterday, but for a few years, and we'll follow that, not once a year, but every board meeting starts with where are we on new risks or past risks, what have we done, is there something new? And the other word I've not heard is the executives. I said the board are the doers, but we are not the doers of the operations. We are the doers for the strategy, for the nomination of executive, for the control, but the executive do the job every day and sometimes every night for many of them. And don't forget, the executive, in my view, are the most important because they operate. Of course, they need to be controlled, supported, monitored, but they are, and at least in some countries or in most countries, they are members of the board, more or less. Sometimes you have 1, 2, 3, 4. They are never the majority of the board, but they are sometimes a significant part of the board, especially in the UK system where the executive, the top executives are part of the board. So the last point I want to mention is I totally agree with Salla and DG Justice in general. I don't agree on every detail of what you do, but I agree when you say that politicians, regulators, country governments, whoever, must play their role because companies alone will not do it. It is a combination. In French, I would say en même temps. You need the politicians, the government, and the companies to work cooperatively, which doesn't mean we agree on everything, but we need to prepare together the legislation, the regulations, the things which we can then translate in our boards and in our companies and ask the executives to do. Just a small example, don't forget the electric cars will be much more pushed by the mayors of the big cities in the world and therefore by their regulations and their government regulations than by anyone else. And if you take the cigarette industry, the regulators have been a great part in making people smoke less, because in countries where there is no regulations on cigarettes, people smoke more and more. Last point, we are all humans, therefore we are not perfect. We know that there will always be problems, scandals, hopefully not too many. Whether they are in the political circle, governments, companies, I want to come back to what our colleague from OECD said. I think the leaders about trust, today the problem is that trust, no leader gets trusted by people. It's generic. Whether you are a corporation, an institution, a church, a religion, whatever, the trust needs to come back, yes, but the coming back will not be by additional decisions or additional slogans. It will come through behaviors of the people who are in charge of governments, institutions, DGs, companies, churches even, because I don't think in this field things are very different. So we need to get inspired by what happens in other fields and indeed work together. Last point, I've not heard a lot about competition. The EU is not living in a cuckoo land world where everything is perfect. We are better, we do and the OECD people will certainly think about it. And at United Nations even more. We cannot live in a world where we stop doing things because of principles, and the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans do it in parallel, and our corporations would be harmed in that way. So I think we have to balance, and that's what I call the transition period. Things will not happen tomorrow morning, but in a transition period, we need to be considering that if we continue like this, there is a point where you have to stop operating in South Africa, in South America, in Africa, in some parts of Europe, not the EU, the rest, in Asia. What is the other continent?
Australia, North America.
No, Australia is a good citizen in OECD.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's for... Michel, you did mislead me. You said in conclusion, and you said that 3 times. So I kept thinking you were going to finish.
It was my advantage of it.
There you go. All right. Aleksandra from EFAMA, please give us your sense.
Thank you, Jyoti. I'll follow, the honors, maybe, trying to face you all while I'm speaking. I think even though we should not really introduce ourselves, I'm thinking I need to explain what EFAMA is, because the name doesn't really, I would say a lot by itself. We represent the interests of the asset management industry. And I'm not sure whether all of you are familiar who are asset managers, what we do, because very often we could be put in a bucket, generic bucket of investors, and I think to a certain extent we are, but basically we actually manage our clients' money, meaning the end investors' money. and investors being institutional investors, like for instance pension funds or insurance companies, or retail investors. So basically, asset manager, invest the money. Well, they manage the portfolios. And also, for instance, it might depend. Sometimes they, on discretionary basis, will just execute the orders of their clients. But they also can manage the portfolio by basically making their own investment decision in line with the mandate agreed with the end investor. And as within this part, we basically act as stewards, of our clients' money. What does it mean? That means that we try to ensure that we can deliver the best long-term value, or for whatever period of time it's actually prescribed, for our clients. And that also means engaging with companies. And within this engagement, actually environmental and social aspects are already increasingly being actually discussed within the meetings with the board members, with the management of the company. And actually quite a lot is already being done, I would say, in terms of trying to influence, well, the strategy of the company, but also the board composition, but also, the generic aspects, to what extent companies are taking environmental and social and not only the governance aspects into account in their, operations and decisions. And I think that's a very important point. And what Michel mentioned, it's always very easy to focus on the bad guys, to talk about the short-termism of investors. But actually there is a lot of also, long-term investors and basically, a lot of long-term engagement being done, trying to, I would say, constructively and positively create the value for the investors, but also for, I would say, society at large. And of course, there are, I would say, asset managers that have very different funds. So for instance, thematic funds. Some of them are purely focused on environmental and social aspects. And you may be aware that actually right now there is a lot of EU legislation in the pipeline called, sustainable finance package. And actually now asset managers and institutional investors will be subject to a lot of new rules, including, detailed disclosures in terms of, how these aspects are taken into account and what is the impact and risk from the environment on the investment, but also how the investment impacts the environment, social and governance factors. And, but actually in order to achieve that, in order to be able to do that, what do we need? We need the data. We need the ESG comparable, good quality data in order to be able actually to deliver that. But more importantly, and I think, it hasn't been, I would say, to my taste, stressed enough actually in the presentation, actually in the excellent report by Accountancy Europe, actually it has been pointed out the importance of actually revising the corporate reporting in Europe. And the fact that, actually this kind of data is necessary, and it's not only necessary for the investors or asset managers, it actually is also necessary for the companies, for the boards, for the management, in order to be able to actually, take the informed decisions. Because right now, unfortunately, this data very often is missing. And but well, maybe just to come back, I would say, to some of the short-term also aspects which are, I think, important, and maybe role of the regulators, because I think this is one of my favorite parts, actually, in the report. What in a way could be also done from the regulatory side, to improve the situation. I think it is very important that actually regulators create simple and, regulation, and at the same time, enforce it well. Because unfortunately, over-complexity leads to excessive costs, but also, very often results in legal uncertainty, and also, maybe some errors, mistakes, which are not necessarily due to the fact that somebody doesn't want to follow the rules, but they do not necessarily, they don't necessarily understand the rules. And sometimes national regulators, they don't really provide enough guidance in that respect either. So this is quite important. It's also important that regulators provide the right incentives, doing, for instance, a lot of research and studies, like for instance, in terms of sustainable finance, will it really deliver its aim? At the end of the day, asset management industry can do everything, can provide all the information they have and are able to obtain. But the thing is, the decision always rests with the end investor. So will the end investors actually be incentivized to invest into, for instance, companies or projects that are sustainable but are maybe not necessarily delivering, the same money, the same returns? And I think here is the role of the regulators to actually provide, for instance, like for good data, actually emphasizing and showing, that, for instance, this kind of projects can also actually bring the returns, because for the moment there is a lot of contradictory actually research on that. So I think that's quite important. And just coming back to the incentives and short-termism and role of the regulators, maybe to a certain extent, it's also too important to see how the incentives are set for the companies. And it's true that, okay, shareholders might sometimes push companies in ways which are not always desirable, but it's also, for instance, what are the incentives in terms of the remuneration of directors and management designed, and whether they actually support long-termism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead. We do have the challenge that the asset managers are often being asked by the people who are investing money with them to deliver on financial performance. And then, of course, we've got all these other issues that need to be brought in play. And Aleksandra, you're suggesting maybe there are some metrics that can help guide us in a particular direction. Andrew, EY was involved in the embankment project for inclusive capitalism, the EPIC project, and metrics played a part in that. Is that something that you want to bring to this discussion, or
yeah,
go ahead?
I'll, if you don't mind, what I'll do is I'll cover that in more detail a bit later in relation to some of my comments. But I mean, I'll cover it at a high level now. But you're absolutely right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks first to Accountancy Europe for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure, and I commend you on your great report. I'll just take a quick leaf out of Aleksandra's book, which is to explain why EY is interested in good corporate governance. And clearly, in terms of our purpose in building a better working world, we believe it's in the interest of everyone.
I still want to hear about the report. Okay?
I know, and I'm going to tell you. I'm going to get to it. I'm going to get to it very quickly, I promise you. In fact, in about three minutes, I would say, maybe even less. Okay. But it's important to us and to everyone that the business is sustainable in the long term for the prosperity of everyone. But even more closer to home, we believe that good corporate governance environments help us do our public interest role as auditors. So that's the last thing I was going to say about our interest in the topic. What do I want to say about this report and to answer Jyoti's question about metrics? I completely agree. I think one of the comments that was made in the last session about the trade-offs that would have to be made is that while at a conceptual level I agree that we need to be managing all stakeholder interests, I actually think for a board under the current framework in which they operate, that's really hard, because by the very nature of managing different interests, there will be trade-offs. But I think there is a way to square that circle, which is now going to come on to metrics, which is by boards and companies providing a much clearer picture about how the purpose of the company, its strategy, what stakeholder outcomes that they're actually seeking in pursuing that strategy, what their contribution is to achieving those outcomes, and how they're measuring it. And why do I say that? It's because that doesn't relate just to pure financial values, it relates to pre-financial information. How they're managing things like social capital, human capital, environmental capital has an impact on future cash flows. And so investors are already making investment decisions based on information they get in all sorts of areas, narrative and such like. But is it really prepared with enough veracity for them to really take it fully into account and understand the financial impacts? I'd argue not. And that's where the report that we worked on with over 30 different multinationals in the asset management, asset owner and asset creator space over the last 2 years. The report came out in November. It's called the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism. It's a bit of a plug. It wasn't EY, just EY. As I say, it was a lot of international organisations that were involved. And the big thing about the report itself is that the methodology in there that describes that process that I just talked about is completely open source. If you go to chapter 9 of that report, it has a step-by-step approach where a company or its board can sit down and say, okay, how do we do this? Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
A couple of other points, just quick fire ones. I understand that the Commission is going to be publishing proposals that companies disclose a sustainability strategy. My challenge would be, what's the difference between a sustainability strategy and a strategy? I think we need to make this a business issue. It's not a CSR issue anymore, even though, to Olivier's point, this is becoming a short-term, immediate issue. I do think it relates to more than just climate change. It relates to some of those mega trends that I talked about. It relates to the space in which companies find themselves in this new rapidly changing world, the license to operate that they have from consumers, employees and such like. And I think we need to take that really seriously because the world is changing very rapidly. And I will just make a couple more points. Europe is also concerned with inclusive growth. And I think we need to think very carefully about how this agenda is applied in such a way that we don't see the ability to participate in capital growth be moved away from as many people as possible. And what do I mean is we don't want to apply it to things just like listed companies, etc., and see money move away from markets. We need to make sure that in moving the agenda towards a more sustainable economy that everyone, as many people as possible, can participate in the growth that we're still seeking for economic prosperity. And I'll probably leave it there. I've got more points to make, but
we'll see how we fare.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much. Sebastien, you're hearing these people argue about actually we don't need substantive change immediately because there's already change taking place. Some others were saying, well, investors might be driven by other things, etc. In effect, I guess you're representing society here. You're the World Wildlife Fund, and you're seeing biodiversity being smashed across collapsing, and we're in the sixth extinction of species that is happening. Do you believe them? Do you buy their story? Do you think this is acceptable?
Only partly.
Okay, go for it.
Actually, we've been very interested in a paper from Accountancy Europe, and especially on the policy side, because we think as WWF that it's high time to regulate, so we're really supportive of, I think it's the point 9 of the paper, which is on creating an EU regulatory framework on corporate governance for the single market. And there are 3 reasons for that. The first one is urgency, as Olivier presented very clearly. We have a huge climate challenge, we have biodiversity collapse, and we need to get much faster. We need to accelerate the transition in any possible way. And one of the ways, as mentioned by different speakers, is regulation. The second reason is that voluntary initiatives are not enough. They're not quick enough, they're not sufficient enough. And also something we notice with voluntary initiatives, including on reporting, for example. CDP has been doing great reporting work on climate data. And even with the backing of a huge amount of investors, CDP has noticed that they reach something like 80% of the companies doing climate reporting. And then above this, they are stalled. So you always have something like 15-20% of the markets being laggards that do not want to move forward unless they are required to do it by law. And we cannot afford to have 20% of the economy not accepting and not shifting towards a more sustainable business because of the magnitude of the challenge. We need everybody on board. 20% is too much. So regulation is needed for this, to have all these players on board, including the laggards. And the third reason is, the opposite is because, it's for the corporate leaders. As WWF, you might know, we are working with many corporate leaders, many financial leaders. We are even partnering with many of them in order to create new precedents, in order to implement proactive commitments of companies, voluntary commitments of companies to reduce their negative impacts and improve their sustainability performance. And I have had many conversations with these leaders, and many of them tell me, look, here is our best practice today. We know we can do more than that. We would like to do more than that, but we feel if we do it now, it's too far compared to the current market. So we put ourselves at risk of losing customers, of losing competitiveness, as Michel mentioned. So we can only go that far for the moment. if there is a regulation creating a level playing field, then it creates more room for the leaders to go one step beyond. And many leaders have told me this. We now want a regulation, and then we can go even beyond. And they are not concerned with the regulation precisely because they are already ahead of it. And actually, you have more and more corporate leaders supportive, publicly supporting regulation because they know it will be a kind of lowest denominator, and they will already be ahead of it. And they will be able to do more. So that's super interesting. And given the challenges, the magnitude and the urgency of the challenges I mentioned, we also need the corporate leaders, the financial leaders, to, again, be as fast as possible in terms of improving and creating new best practices every day. So that's really, really interesting. Yeah, I think I stop this here.
Okay.
So maybe a last element more for the Commission itself at EU level. We now see more and more discussions on corporate governance in more and more member states. There are already mandatory due diligence, due diligence regulations, for example, in France, in Netherlands, in Switzerland as well. Well, it's not the EU, it's not very far. There are also public discussions on such due diligence mandatory regimes in Germany, in Finland, in Sweden, etc., etc. So if the EU wants to avoid a due diligence mandatory framework in the EU that is composed of 28 different regulations, if businesses are interested in terms of simplification, we think it's high time for an overarching regime on due diligence. And maybe a suggestion to on the paper of Accountancy Europe, which is in terms of going slightly beyond what is proposed and becoming more specific on this mandatory corporate governance regime. One element I just mentioned that is increasingly discussed is the specific due diligence issue for large corporates to reduce their negative environmental and social impacts on people and planet. Another element already discussed by the Commission is to explore directors' duties, which is separate and complementary to due diligence in our view. And the third element that I think is extremely important and that Andrew mentioned is to make sustainability strategies and targets mandatory at board level.
Super. Thank you very much. All right. You've heard a number of shades of opinion about how this can work. Some saying we need to move faster, some saying we're already moving pretty fast, we don't need to move any faster. What do you think? What are your views? And I'm conscious that, I come from New Delhi, that's where I grew up. We've just had 48-degree weather, so in case you're thinking, oh, it's pretty hot in here, can I really work in these kind of temperatures, feeling a bit drowsy? I come from 48 degrees, okay? Doesn't apply. Let's hear your best input now. So go ahead. So we have a question here.
Hi, my name is Marianne Jurke and I'm an accountant. So I'm coming at this subject from an accounting point of view. So it's more of an observation that I would like to make is that we like numbers and we like metrics because we accountants deal with that. But the contradiction here is that impact is very complex and you cannot always measure this in numbers. So I think we need to also change the way we are interacting in our business context, and instead of coming with numbers, we need to come with questions. And I think that this, my opinion, is that the role of the accountant is to bring questions.
So perhaps building on the comment made by Mervyn King earlier about how accountants need to move from being accounting about financial capital to being value officers, dealing with value in multidimensional terms. Okay, any other comments or questions? Another question from here. Yes, please, go ahead. Were you happy with the answers you got the first time?
Yes and no, actually.
Okay,
but,
yeah, so then there's a...
I to entertain the discussion because I thought maybe the practical proposals were not enough, but I understand it's very complex. So, so you will not be surprised that my new comment will also be a bit straightforward and will be addressed to Aleksandra Palinska as representative of EFAMA. Because from my experience on trying to draft legislation, including at EU level, I think asset managers have been probably the worst force ever trying to combat anything good we were trying to do. And among them, EFAMA was the worst of the worst. Ooh. Because you were very, very efficient, very professional, very good, very convinced that you were doing the right thing, but doing it, in my view, in the wrong direction. I'll take just one example. You said, well, basically you always try to push back on legislation and say we want self-regulation. And the way you do that, you gave a very good example. You said, well, we want a very good regulation. Regulation needs to be very simple. So when there is a very simple regulation which is proposed, the answer is, oh, but you don't know anything about what you're talking about. You know, it's so simple that it's not applicable to X, Y, Z. And you are right. Because if it is simple, it will not address in any detail any specific issues. So we can come back with a very detailed regulation saying now everything is covered. And then the answer is, oh no, come on, see how much it's going to cost. You know, you're just killing the industry. That's not fair. You know, we don't deserve that. So let us just be in charge of ourselves. But the truth is, in the last 20 years, self-regulation has been a complete failure. It hasn't failure regarding what we're talking here. There are other issues where it's effective, but about what we're talking here, it's been a failure. If we look at any substantial results you've brought, I think there are none. There are glossy, you know, presentations, nice websites, but what has been actually achieved by asset managers, EFAMA, and other associations, I'm talking about EFAMA because you are here, but you're not the only one. I think it's very little, or substantially nothing. So my question is, you know, why not change your job and go on the bright side of the force?
Well, I don't know. Do you want to respond? I think this deserves a response, but I think perhaps not just for EFAMA, but on behalf of all who have been saddled with the self-regulation challenge here.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to defend myself and the industry I represent. Well, first, I think nobody likes to be regulated. Okay, let's be frank. Who of you likes to be regulated? We like to ask for regulation of others. Okay,
we've got a few.
But I'm sorry. At the end of the day, none of us like prescriptive rules.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, fine. We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Okay, but at least in terms of industry, investors, non-investors, okay, nobody likes to be regulated. Okay, and even in the accountancy. Okay, we'll come back to that. Even in the thought leadership Accountancy Europe paper, okay, there is an entire chapter which I very much support on the fact that the rules need to be, you know, simple, you know, enforceable, and that basically, you know, it has to make sense. And I would put it this way: the regulation has to strike the right balance. Okay. Right now, the rules got us whether we wanted it or not, okay? The sustainable finance, like the EU taxonomy, disclosures regulation, amendments to UCITS, IFMD, MiFID II, short terms, whatever, it's all coming at us, okay? And we're not gonna escape, but fine. The rules are designed, but let's just make sure it makes sense, because right now, actually, there is actually no even proper, I would say the definitions are not the same across the different regulations, okay? The requirements are, I would say, not necessarily consistent, to a certain extent duplicative, but not exactly. I mean, it's all very confusing, okay? The TAC just produced 400 pages of the report, okay? Fine, I remember...
Aleksandra,
yeah,
what if we had a framework that covered all of these issues? We accept that there's going to be duplication when you put this piece and this piece of regulation and this piece of regulation, we put them all together. But actually, if the report that Olivier was talking about was suggesting perhaps there could be room for a Europe-wide framework for corporate governance regulation, is that something that you feel could actually be helpful in this context?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, this is the part where we're coming that we like others to be regulated, right? So the thing is, in terms of corporate governance, it's more about companies. But of course, our members, especially the ones that are global, they would like to see a little bit more consistency, okay? And for instance, would like to see, I don't know, a bit more uniformity in terms of corporate governance, for instance, you know, like rules across Europe. It would be easier for them and more comparable. And actually, for instance, we as EFAMA, we also trying to actually encourage our members to do the right thing. We actually issued a stewardship code, which is a European one, okay, which is not supposed to replace the national existing codes or whatever, but we're trying to actually, you know, encourage our members and, you know, and also address actually environmental and social aspects in the debates, okay? We're trying actually to promote the best practice. And,
so you're trying to come over to the bright side?
Yes, of course, we are trying our best to come to the bright side.
Okay.
And, yeah. So
well, let's stop here, but I think it sounds to me like there is a debate and a discussion that's worth continuing in this area. Before you jump, is it about this particular?
Can I respond
okay,
to
very
that?
quick.
I'm going to, is the mic on? Hello?
Yeah,
good. Yeah. I'm going to respond by sort of agreeing and disagreeing with the point made. But it comes back to something that Michel made about policymakers and regulators working in tandem with business. And this is a complex system that we're operating in, and we need to make sure get all the parts of it working together in the right way. So although I think the investment industry has a case to answer in terms of how much investment it puts into stewardship compared to how much it says it wants to put into stewardship, I think there are economics at play there and you know, what clients want and all that kind of thing. I think it's a bit unfair to kind of put a public interest responsibility for saving the planet on one group.
Yeah.
And that's all I'll say.
Okay.
But and another plug for the metrics though, but what I think we can do is do a better job of getting investors to do the job that they currently do even better in pursuit of this agenda, which is to give them long-term value metrics.
Okay, thank you. Sebastien.
Yeah, can I add a point on the reporting element? Because there was a very good question on the need to have meaningful, comparable data on sustainability. And this is, in our view, the major flaw of the non-financial reporting directive, which is that it's a great directive to many extents, but the problem is it is not helping at all to standardize or even to harmonize the reporting frameworks on sustainability issues. It did not want to choose anything. So that means each and every company covered by the directive is allowed to select the reporting framework it wants, or is even allowed to create its own reporting. So let's make a parallel with financial accounting. Imagine each and every company that has to produce financial accounting is allowed to develop its own reporting template on financial accounting. Interesting, huh? Impossible. It has to become the same gradually for sustainability data, because as long as they are not comparable, it's extremely hard for investors, banks, but also companies themselves to take them into account, to properly compare themselves with the peers, the comparable companies, etc., etc. So the Commission will very likely review the non-financial reporting directive, and it's, in our view, a key requirement to make sure that the data become increasingly comparable, which means, in our view, to create sector-specific key performance indicators that would be mandatory for the companies. Leaving it to the companies to report on additional metrics if they wish, because you have innovation, because it's hard to capture all issues in a given point in time. But agreeing at sector-specific level that some metrics are required for some sectors. And there's already a lot of evidence or many guidelines that the European can use for this. The TCFD on climate, the taxonomy that is currently mapping all the proper criteria and threshold to define green activities, etc. So the non-financial reporting directive has to be aligned with the taxonomy and with these different guidelines that are already available out there to make sure this sustainability reporting becomes comparable for the peers in a given market. Otherwise, it's almost impossible for investors to properly integrate this.
Okay, thank you. I just want to be sure that when we talk about these sustainability metrics, we don't get carried away that somehow those metrics are the issue. I think the sense I get from Olivier's report is that all these issues are creating a huge challenge for business as a whole. and we need to make sure that we're addressing all of these issues. I know we're pretty much come to the end of the time that we can do this, but I'm conscious there are a couple more people who wanted to have their say. So let me see if we can, if you can very quickly make your comment, and then we'll see how we bring this to a close. Go ahead.
Hi, Annelies de Wilde from the Belgian Directors Institute and also from the Belgian Corporate Governance Committee. Thanks to Florence for mentioning the Belgian Corporate Governance Code. We worked for 2 years on it, so we're happy to release it recently. And then I come back to the discussion on this European Common Corporate Governance Code. I think if in Belgium we worked on it for 2 years, I think it's impossible to have one code for the whole of Europe. I agree that it's easier for investors because then you have a level playing field, but it doesn't take into account the culture of the country, etc.
Okay, so that's a comment to be made. And yes, one for you. I like your fan, by the way. Can you share it around? Okay.
I'm going to try to frame it somehow. I think my question is sort of related to also the board's role in changing corporate culture. So I think the status quo of business today, there's still too much kind of, when a scandal pops up, there's, you know, things are dealt with behind closed doors, everything is done, everyone is paid to make sure things don't go to the press. When there is an issue in terms of employees being abused, etc., people are paid, someone is silently walked nicely out the door. There's still too much of this kind of stuff going on, and I think there's, related again to the whole trust issue as well, boards, and I saw that there is a chapter kind of on this in terms of making board composition fit for renewed purpose. And I wonder if one of the criteria in there should be, you know, board members should have the guts basically to talk about what's going badly and within the company as well. Because it's only, I think, if people are actually transparent, and it's a very human thing, if you can be transparent about your weaknesses and about what you've kind of screwed up and where things have gone wrong, rather than constantly, it's the same with reporting. A lot of reporting is about everything that is going right and all the great things companies are doing. People don't want to talk about all the bad things that are going on. So there's still, there's a shift, I think, that's necessary, and I think boards have a big role to play in changing a bit that corporate culture in terms of going and talking about what's going badly. And I think it's only when people in power can be transparent about the stuff that is going badly that, you know, society can hold those companies accountable, that then companies can do certain things so that they improve their credibility, and then there can be more trust. And if there is more trust, you also don't need all this discussion maybe around legislation, and you know, it's more human.
So you see trust and regulation as being, you know, they fit together. If you're missing trust, perhaps you need more regulation. If there is more trust, maybe the regulation
exactly.
can be
and also
more lightweight.
that boards should play a role in actively changing the corporate culture in terms of transparency.
Okay, we've had a number of issues that have been raised, and I hope this is going to be valuable input for Olivier and his team in terms of thinking about where their report is going and what they could be doing with it. Florence and Michel, I'm conscious that you haven't had a chance to add your response to any of the comments that you've heard. And I want to give you, but no 3 points of conclusion, okay? I just want 1 point of conclusion from you, Michel. And then Florence, if you would also, if you're interested in doing that. Okay.
Okay. I think the board, there was a question about the structure of board and board. We come back to it. I think it's about composition of board.
Yeah.
Take people who have the courage, who have experience. Experience doesn't mean age. Eh? If you want a digital expert, he must not be 70, he must be 25. Diversity of origins, of CVs, of cultures. Processes. Ensure you have committees who work the chairs of the committees in the board are the important members of the board. And you seem to imply that we hide everything. It's not true. I am on the board of a company where we have been condemned for corruption, anti-competition in Brussels. And we are the first to talk about it and to ask every quarter the news about it. So, of course, there are bad pupils, there are bad people, but there are also good pupils and good people. But I stop here.
All right, thank you. And Florence.
Okay, just to reinforce what Michel said about boards, I think that you mentioned, Michel, that actually boards are looking at the risk and that this is increasing on the agenda, and this is something you have each time, so I think risk includes also anything that can trigger the reputation of the company, and maybe this is also part of the answer. But I want to come back to the question, you know, from the accounting perspective and about the metrics, because, I mean, we represent the companies, and of course they look at their figures. And one of the things we want to underline, and particularly linked to the reporting on extra financial rating agencies or sustainability agencies, is that our members reported that there are multiple and diverse approach there in terms of the methodologies that they are using, which results in many questionnaires. And actually they are choosing to which questionnaire they will answer because they cannot answer to all of them. So that's the first thing. So maybe to improve the situation, we should look at having maybe a code of conduct that they apply, and that the reporting will be according to that as a comply or explain principles with some minimum transparency requirements. So this is, you know, something we looked at. I think, you know, maybe a more general conclusion is that we are talking a lot about sustainability to drive, you know, the business and to stay in business. At EuropeanIssuers, we represent companies that are listed on the stock exchange. They need finance to transition toward this sustainable economy. And the current context is a context of delisting. It's a context of companies going out of the regulated market for the reason that the regulation is too burdensome. And I know, Olivier, that it's always the same, the same speech. But it's evidence with figures, and figures matters. So the question is, how are we going to take this also into consideration, when moving forward to the future?
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our participants here, and I hope you join me in thanking them in the traditional way. There's clearly so much more we can talk about, but we've got to go home. And in conclusion, I'm going to invite two of our two people to come here to bring us to a sharp conclusion, hopefully. I'm going to invite Paul Druckman to come up. And Paul was the first CEO of the International Integrated Reporting Council. And he's also been involved with the work that Accountancy Europe has done in putting this, I believe you've been a part of this task force. Yep. So we can blame you for some of the issues we've heard today.
No, it's Olivier.
Oh, it's Olivier, okay, fine. And so we might as well bring Olivier up as well. Because Olivier, yeah, just come on up and we'll bring this to a conclusion. But Paul, have you heard anything here that gives you a sense that you can see a direction going forward? What needs to be done? Or did you feel you already knew what needed to be done and you can share that with us?
Okay, I had a whole prepared speech, but I don't think you want to hear me. But I come from Zimbabwe where it's hot, so it doesn't matter. I'm fine. I suppose if I had a couple of reflections, I think, to be fair, I think there's still this lack of understanding of the urgency that we have in the world at the moment from those that are representing the capital market. And the capital market could be said to have been successful, but it could also be said to be destroying everything that we exist to do. It needs to change with an urgency. It needs disruption. It cannot continue as it is. And I know that those representing capital market players don't have the opportunity to to counter that, but it does worry me. When I've been the regulator in the UK in the accounting and corporate governance and stewardship world for the last few years, and we have substantially changed the definition of what a steward is and what a company's board, what the corporate governance is all about. And it is not about the corporation, it is about how they affect the society and the economies that they exist in, because that is why they have a license to operate. They are limited in some degree. They shouldn't be allowed to destroy our planet and other things. So that's just from the heart. I think there are many things that we haven't touched on here, which is the role of accountants, but I won't go into that at the moment, although I think Mervyn's early intervention around the moving from a CFO to a CVO is absolutely critical. And if the benchmarking project and integrated reporting and all these other things have one thing in common, and they do have lots in common, it is around that we should be looking at value and not at finance, because finance is only one component part of value. I built my own business and have been involved in this. If we look at from small business to the large listed companies, they need to radically be disrupted, and we need to make sure that we are part of that disruption. Because it takes me back to the wonderful cartoon, I don't know if you've seen it, of a fishbowl full of water with Greta Thunberg sitting in the middle of the fishbowl and her mother telling her off because she's not doing her homework, whereas on the side of the fishbowl, right, a glass fishbowl, there's a hole. And that's how I see us at the moment. These sorts of reports from Accountancy Europe, it's radical for Accountancy Europe. I think that's I used to be involved in Accountancy Europe, and it is pretty radical. And I really compliment Olivier and Irina and the whole team for doing such a fantastic job. We did a very small part. You guys did it all. And I hope that this gets the airing that it needs. And I'll leave it there.
Okay.
You get the claps because you were very kind to me. So, yeah. The bad news is that I understand we have a bit more time than we originally planned. So I still have
I was seeking
more or
to
less
bring this
an
to
hour and a half to
really?
speak. No, okay. No, I'll keep it very short. It's hot. Everybody wants to have a drink. Maybe I would just like to say a few words on what actually prevents change. Because, we all have different views. We say, yes, we understand there may be couple of things we need to change. But at the end of the day, what are the main impediments to change? What prevents us from really addressing the issue? Because we're not addressing the issue, okay? I made a couple of notes, but very, very quickly just to share with you. What today's tell me is that, we still do not have the level of awareness that we need. I think Paul made the point. And I think the problem we have is that we in this room, our generation, we're more or less, between a bunch of 10, 20 years all around here, we do not understand what young people out there and what the scientific community is saying. And that is a fundamental problem. Especially, I think, in this town. And I thought the gentleman up there who had a go at Aleksandra, actually, I didn't understand why he was targeting EFAMA, because I thought he would be talking about all of us in this town. That's effectively, most of the time, how we collectively go about issues. We agree, but, or this is too difficult, this is too costly. This is, I've been hearing that for more than 25 years where I've been involved on the lobbying scene here. And when you talk about cost, which is one of the main elements that people bring up, this is too costly. Well, if I look, and I've been reading a lot of scientific evidence lately on that, which makes me worried. If we look at the cost of what is lying ahead of us, believe me, the cost of more stringent regulation, the cost of more disclosures, the cost of change is nothing compared to what is lying ahead, which is really, I think, a significant risk of collapse of our systems and societies. Now, the second thing that then we say is, yeah, I hear what you say, but, no radical issue. This is for the long term. That was true 40 years ago. It's not true today. So this is a short-term issue. And I think the distinction that we make between long-term and short-term is becoming toxic. What we have to deal with is consequences that are growingly impacting business today, not future generations. So I think we really also here have to change the way we think and we go about these issues, because our business as usual attitude is equivalent to denial. So we got to change. But the real difficult nut to crack, I think, was mentioned a couple of times. I heard Michel use the word, it's competition, competitiveness. That is the one thing that prevents everybody from, taking the step that need to be taken. So at country level, we don't want to legislate because it is going to undermine the competitiveness of the country. At company level, that was also explained very well, we're not going to take that step beyond regulation because it may undermine our competitive position. Well, if we continue on that line, we're just all going to lose out. So I think it is really times where we have to question the way we think. Reason why I came up with the slide of Mr. Einstein. I mean, we today, again, are addressing what is a totally different issue that we've never seen before, with the type of thinking that has led us in the situation, I should say, in the dead end in which we are.
So let's have an extreme perspective on this. During World War II, there was a war going, and businesses around the world, or in certain countries at least, changed what they did to fit the war effort.
I think
so I want to ask you the question. Yeah. Are we in a war footing at the moment? Is this what it needs? Is this what it will take for us to be accepting that the scale of the problem is so huge, the job is so huge? If in the past we produced cars, we now need to produce tanks, because that's the change that we're talking about. So I want to check that with you.
I think it's a great example that you're giving, Jyoti, because this is exactly what happened during Second World War. Companies changed their business model. The war effort all of a sudden became a priority. And those who were building cars started building tanks. Good example. But that was valid across, the entire US industry in reality. Those producing boats were putting all their boats at the service of, coming to rescue Europe. People were accepting tax rates that were near 100%, sometimes above that. And everybody accepted that because the matter was saving the Western world and our civilization. Well, today, the issue is more important than that. And it seems that we don't want to see it. So yes, I think this is the direction of travel, personally. Okay,
well, that's quite a sobering way to think about a corporate governance report. And maybe you weren't quite ready to see it in that way. Maybe we're still got to have that discussion as to, are we at that place where this is about a war footing or not? I guess I'm going to close with one little comment, which is that it is a huge challenge out there, because we could be in a place where we see the sixth mass extinction taking place and we think, my goodness, what are we doing about this? It could be we're in a place where saying, look, we're trying to do every bit we possibly can today. Why are you giving us more challenges to do? Life is tough enough as it is. And I wanted to share with you the comment from one of the great corporate governance experts around. His name is Mo Salla. Okay, some of you are laughing because Mo Salla is a footballer, and he was in a stadium where his team, Liverpool, were playing Barcelona, and the task was impossible. There was no way Liverpool could win that game, and Mo Salah's job was absolutely impossible because he's the main goal scorer for Liverpool, but he was sitting on the sidelines because he was injured. So what was his message to the team? You could see it if you were watching that game. You would see it because every now and then the cameras would shift to Mo Salah sitting there trying to urge his team on to do this absolutely impossible thing. And on his T-shirt, a huge message: never give up. And I think that's where we are. So often we can look at what we're doing and we say, we just can't change it. We're the main goal scorer, but we're sitting on the sidelines. Oh, we're not even the main goal scorer. The main goal scorer should be doing something about this. They're not doing what they have to do. We can't give up. Never give up. You know what happened to Liverpool, of course. They went on to win the European Championships. But we're not in that state where we could just conveniently win one game and then we're done. We're in this for our lives. So thank you for sharing the report, and thank you for leading us into a new discussion. And I hope that this will be something we will not give up on. Thank you very much for coming.